Knock knock, the candy man's here. Halloween night in the quiet suburb of Maplewood had always been a night of laughter, costumes, and overflowing candy bags. The streets were alive with children running door to door, chanting, "Trick or treat," while porch lights glowed warmly against the autumn chill. For Jacob, Olivia, Ryan, and Emily, this was their last year of trick-or-treating. At 14, they were teetering on the edge of childhood and the awkward reality of growing up. Determined to make this Halloween their best, they mapped out the wealthiest houses in the neighborhood, knowing those were the ones that handed out the best candy. But as they turned onto Holloway Street, something felt wrong. Holloway had always been a dead-end street, the last row of houses sitting in a neat line. Yet tonight, an unfamiliar house stood at the very end, a house that had never been there before. It was an old Victorian-style home, its warped wooden panels and cracked windows looking decades older than anything in the neighborhood. Faint, flickering lights glowed inside, and a lone pumpkin sat carved on the porch, its grin too wide, too jagged. A strange, sweet scent, like burnt caramel and something rotten underneath, lingered in the cold air. Ryan nudged Olivia. "That house wasn't here last year, right?" "No way," she whispered, gripping her candy bag. Jacob, the bravest of the group, smirked. "Well, we're here now. Only one way to find out what kind of candy they give." Emily hesitated. "I don't think we should." Knock. 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 Before she could finish, Jacob had already knocked on the heavy wooden door. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, a shuffling sound came from within, slow and deliberate, like someone dragging something across the floor. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. Then, a voice, soft, wet, and sticky, like something speaking through a mouthful of syrup, whispered. "Trick, or treat." The word slithered through the air, thick and unnatural. Jacob, grinning, stepped forward. "Treat, duh." A long, gloved hand emerged from the darkness, holding out a single wrapped piece of red candy. It was unlike anything they had seen before, glistening, almost pulsing. Jacob snatched it up. "Sweet," he laughed, unwrapping the candy and popping it into his mouth before the others could protest. It melted instantly on his tongue, flooding his mouth with a too sweet, burnt sugar taste. For a moment, he frowned, something about it tasted wrong, metallic almost. Then, the door slammed shut, shaking the house. A gust of icy wind blasted past them, making the trees shudder violently. The streetlights flickered. The scent of burnt caramel and rot grew stronger. "Jacob?" Olivia whispered. Jacob blinked. His pupils were blown wide, his face pale. He looked at them, but it was as if he wasn't really seeing them. And then, he grinned. A wide, too wide grin, stretching across his face, revealing teeth that looked wrong. The wind howled through Holloway Street, carrying the sickly sweet stench of burnt caramel and something rotting beneath it. The unfamiliar house at the end of the road stood silent again, its door shut tight as if it had never opened. Jacob stood in front of it, staring at his friends with a grin too wide, too unnatural. His eyes, once a warm brown, had darkened, pupils swallowing nearly all the color. "Jacob?" Olivia whispered. Jacob blinked rapidly as if shaking something off. His grin faded, and he ran a hand through his hair. What were we doing again?" Ryan frowned. "Dude, are you okay? You just ate that candy and spaced out." Jacob swayed slightly before shaking his head. Yeah, I'm fine. Just felt weird for a sec." He let out a nervous laugh, but his voice sounded wrong. Emily hugged herself, stepping back. "Let's just go. I don't like this place." The others agreed, leaving the eerie house behind. The deeper they walked into the neighborhood, the more normal things felt. Porch lights glowed, jack-o'-lanterns flickered, and kids in costumes ran past, giggling. Jacob seemed back to himself, stuffing candy into his mouth as they continued. But Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then, as they turned onto another street, she noticed something. A group of kids was trick-or-treating on the other side of the road, running up to houses, knocking, laughing. They were the same kids they had passed earlier. The exact same kids, the same costumes, the same movements, their voices repeating the same giggles. It was as if time had reset. She grabbed Emily's arm. "Didn't we see them already?" Emily frowned, glancing across the street. Her face paled. Yeah. We did. Then, something else. The air was colder than before. Not a normal autumn chill, this was biting, unnatural, like the warmth of life itself was being drained away. Ryan shivered. Why does it feel so? Crack. A sharp snapping noise echoed behind them. They spun around. Jacob was gone. Jacob? Olivia called, spinning in circles. 1 second he had been right behind them, now he was nowhere. Emily's breath quickened. Where did he go? Ryan turned in every direction, searching for movement, a shadow, anything. Jacob. Silence. Then. From somewhere far away, barely above a whisper. Trick, or treat. The voice was distorted, stretched out, almost playful. It sounded like Jacob. But it also didn't. Olivia's stomach twisted. She could feel it in her bones, Jacob was gone. And whatever had taken him, wasn't done yet. Jacob was gone. 1 second, he had been right behind them, talking, laughing, eating candy. The next, he had vanished into thin air. No footsteps. No sound. Just, gone. Ryan's breathing grew ragged as he scanned the street, his eyes darting to every dark corner. Jacob, he shouted again, his voice cracking. Nothing. Emily clutched Olivia's arm, her hands ice cold. This isn't right, she whispered. People don't just disappear. The air felt heavier now, pressing down on them. The streetlights flickered, their glow too dim, as if something was draining them of energy. The scent of burnt caramel was stronger than ever. Then, a laugh. Soft. Wet. Wrong. They turned sharply. Standing beneath the glow of a nearby street lamp was Jacob. But something was off. His grin stretched too wide, teeth glistening. His eyes, completely black, void of color. He stood too still, like a marionette waiting for its strings to be pulled. And then he spoke. "Where'd you guys go?" The voice was Jacob's. But it sounded, echoed, as if someone else was speaking with him, through him. Olivia's heart pounded. Jacob. Jacob took a step forward. His body jerked unnaturally, like he wasn't used to moving. He reached into his candy bag and pulled out another red-wrapped piece of candy, the same one he had taken from that house. The candy pulsed. Like it was, breathing. He unwrapped it slowly. Placed it on his tongue. His black eyes stared at them as he chewed. The sound was wet. Sticky. Ryan took a step back. "Dude, what's wrong with you?" Jacob swallowed. His lips curled into a smile. "It's delicious." And then, he lunged. Emily screamed as Jacob grabbed Ryan's wrist with inhuman strength, his grip ice cold. His fingers sank into Ryan's skin, like his flesh was softening beneath his touch. Ryan let out a strangled cry, trying to pull away, but Jacob's grip tightened. His black eyes burned with something hungry. Olivia acted on instinct. She grabbed a nearby plastic pumpkin full of candy and smashed it into Jacob's head. Jacob staggered back, releasing Ryan, his expression twisting into something wrong. His mouth twitched, struggling to form words. Then, In a voice not his own, he whispered. You shouldn't have done that. The streetlights flickered violently, and the world around them shuddered, like reality itself had cracked. And then Jacob collapsed. For a long, horrifying moment, he didn't move. Then, his body started to twitch. And the whisper came again, soft, playful, distant. Trick, or treat. Emily grabbed Olivia's arm. We need to run. Ryan's voice shook. What about Jacob? Olivia stared at Jacob's unmoving body. Something deep inside her knew. That wasn't Jacob anymore. She grabbed Ryan and Emily's hands, and they ran into the night. But the scent of burnt caramel followed them. And from behind them, a wet chewing sound filled the air. Jacob was eating again. The streets were quiet. Too quiet. Olivia, Ryan, and Emily ran through the neighborhood, but something was wrong. The houses, they weren't the same anymore. Doors that had been decorated for Halloween were now boarded up, as if abandoned for years. Jack-o'-lanterns were nothing but rotting husks, their carved smiles sagging. The air smelled of burnt caramel and something sickly sweet, thick like a fog in their lungs. And worst of all, the people were gone. No trick-or-treaters. No porch lights. No cars in driveways. Nothing. Emily clutched Olivia's arm. Where is everyone? Ryan looked around wildly. Dude, this was a full neighborhood 5 minutes ago. What the hell is happening? Then. A distant knock. 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 They froze. The sound came from the end of the street, near a house they didn't recognize. A house that shouldn't be there. It was the same as the one they had seen on Holloway Street, the impossible house. But now, it was closer. And standing in front of it. Jacob. His back was to them, his head tilted slightly, as if listening. Then, without warning, he knocked on the door. The same 3 slow knocks. Knock. 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 The door swung open on its own. A dark hallway stretched beyond it, too long, too deep. The walls seemed to breathe, pulsing with something, alive. Jacob took a step inside. Ryan moved before he could think, grabbing Jacob's shoulder. Dude, stop. Jacob turned his head too far, his neck cracking. His face was wrong. His skin was stretched too tight, like it barely fit over his skull. His grin, unnatural, his teeth longer, sharper. And his eyes. They were gone. Black, empty sockets stared back at Ryan. Jacob opened his mouth. You should try the candy. Ryan screamed as Jacob lunged, his mouth stretching too wide, revealing rows of glistening teeth. Olivia and Emily yanked Ryan back just as Jacob's jaws snapped shut. The door behind him slammed closed. For a second, all was silent. Then. The whispers began. From inside the house. From behind every door. From the shadows. Trick, or treat. Trick, or treat. Ryan panted, clutching his arm where Jacob had touched him. That's not Jacob anymore. That's. Olivia swallowed. Something else. Emily pointed, her voice trembling. Look. The house was multiplying. More doors. More houses. Rows and rows of them, stretching into the distance. And at each doorstep. A figure stood waiting. Some were kids, dressed in costumes, but their eyes were empty. Others were adults, their faces frozen in wide, painful grins. Each one holding a piece of red-wrapped candy. Each one knocking on a door. One by one, the doors swung open. The figures stepped inside. And vanished. The whispers rose to a fever pitch. Trick, or treat. Trick, or treat. Ryan backed away. What the hell is this? Olivia's breath hitched. She finally understood. This wasn't just a town. It was a trap. And Halloween night was when it fed. She grabbed Ryan and Emily's hands. We have to get out of here. Emily shook her head, tears in her eyes. Where do we go? Every street leads back here. Ryan's face twisted in horror. We're stuck. Then. A door creaked open behind them. They turned. A house had appeared right next to them. The door stood ajar, waiting. From inside, something moved. A shadow. A figure. And then. A hand emerged. Gloved. Too long. Fingers curling in a beckoning gesture. A voice, sickly sweet, whispered. Knock, knock, trick, or treat. The candy man had come for them. The door stood open, waiting. From the darkness inside, the gloved hand beckoned. Knock, knock, trick, or treat. Olivia, Ryan, and Emily stood frozen. The whisper slithered into their ears, wrapping around their minds like sticky, rotting caramel. The air grew thick and hot, pressing against their skin. Ryan gripped Olivia's arm. We can't go in. Emily shook her head violently. We won't. The door creaked wider. From inside, the figure stepped out. He was tall and thin, dressed in a tattered, old-fashioned candy vendor's suit, stained with dark patches. His gloves, once white, were now yellowed and cracked. His hat sat crooked on his head, casting a shadow over his gaunt, grinning face. And his teeth. They were sharp, jagged rows of blackened fangs, glistening with something thick and sticky. His eyes were empty sockets, but somehow, they were still watching. In his hand, he held a piece of red-wrapped candy. It pulsed like a heartbeat. The candy man took a step forward. The street behind them vanished, swallowed by darkness. Houses stretched unnaturally in every direction, their doors rattling. So many doors, the candy man whispered. But only one way out. He extended the candy. One bite, and you'll belong. Ryan clenched his fists. Go to hell. The candy man laughed, deep and hollow. Oh, child, we are already there. The houses shuddered, their doors bursting open. And from each doorway, they stepped out. The others. Hundreds of them. Kids. Adults. People who had knocked on the wrong door. People who had taken the candy. Their faces were stretched into wide grins, their skin thin and tight, their eyes nothing but empty pits. They stood in eerie silence, watching. Waiting. Emily whimpered, gripping Olivia's sleeve. What do we do? Olivia's mind raced. There had to be a way out. Jacob had changed after eating the candy. That meant the candy was the source. It was how the candy man fed. A thought hit her like lightning. She turned to Ryan and Emily, whispering, we don't have to run. We just have to destroy the candy. Ryan's eyes widened. But how? Emily suddenly gasped. Fire. The candy man's grin faltered. He took another step forward. Now, there's no need for that. Olivia didn't listen. She grabbed her jack-o'-lantern candy bucket, dumping everything onto the pavement. Among the chocolate bars and lollipops, she spotted a half-melted candle from one of the houses. Ryan scrambled, digging through his pockets. A lighter. He flicked it. A small flame flickered to life. The candy man's smile dropped completely. The whispering voices screamed. The wind howled as the world around them shuddered violently. Olivia grabbed the red-wrapped candy from Jacob's old bag. She held it over the flame. The candy twitched, as if alive. The candy man lunged. No. Emily and Ryan threw their buckets at him, sending candy scattering. Olivia didn't hesitate. She threw the cursed candy into the fire. The moment the flame touched it, the world cracked. The sky split open, revealing a black void filled with screaming faces. The candy man's skin bubbled, melting away. He let out a piercing shriek, his body collapsing into sticky, burning caramel, melting into the pavement. The whispering figures howled, their bodies dissolving into shadows. The houses collapsed, their impossible doors slamming shut one by one. The street began to warp, bending and folding, like a nightmare coming undone. The darkness swallowed everything. And then, silence. Olivia's eyes snapped open. She was lying on the sidewalk. The crisp air of Halloween night was back. The street was normal again. The houses were normal. The smell of burnt caramel was gone. Emily groaned beside her. "Are we back?" Ryan sat up, rubbing his face. "I think we won." But Olivia's stomach twisted. They weren't alone. A few feet away, Jacob lay on the pavement. Still. Silent. Olivia crawled toward him, her breath shaky. "Jacob." She reached out. His eyes snapped open. They were black. A slow, wide grin stretched across his face. And in his hand, he held a single red-wrapped candy. He pressed it to his lips. And bit down. Crunch. The end. Trick or treat. You chose wrong. Halloween night had always been special in Woodbridge. The streets overflowed with children in colorful costumes, their laughter filling the chilly autumn air. Porch lights flickered, casting an orange glow on carved pumpkins and plastic skeletons. But no one ever knocked on the house at the end of Maplewood Street. It had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. Its windows were boarded up, the front yard overgrown, and the mailbox rusted shut. The neighborhood kids called it the Hollow House, because if you listened closely, you could hear whispers coming from inside. Jake, Ryan, and Emily stood in front of the old house, staring at its rotting wooden door. "Dare you to knock," Ryan smirked, adjusting his vampire cape. Jake, always the fearless one, grinned. "Oh, come on. It's just a house." Emily, dressed as a witch, hesitated. "Guys, maybe we shouldn't. My brother told me a story about this place." Ryan scoffed. "Oh, let me guess. It's haunted?" Emily nodded slowly. "He said, one night, someone knocked. And they never came back." Jake rolled his eyes. "Please. It's just a dumb story." And before Emily could stop him, Jake stepped forward. And knocked. Knock. 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 For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the door creaked open. A gust of icy wind rushed out, carrying the scent of rotting leaves and something wrong. Inside, a single candle flickered, casting long, shifting shadows on the peeling walls. And then a voice, low and whispering. "Trick, or treat." Jake turned back to his friends with a cocky grin. "See? Just an old house. Someone probably left a window open." Ryan hesitated. "Dude, maybe we should go." But Jake stepped inside. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut. Emily screamed. Ryan pounded on the door. "Jake! Open up." But inside, Jake was alone. The candlelight flickered violently, casting twisting shadows on the walls. And then, a whisper slithered through the darkness. "You shouldn't have knocked." Jake's breath hitched. Because the voice was right behind him. Jake spun around, his breath caught in his throat. The hallway behind him was pitch black, the candlelight barely reaching past the doorway. But something was there. A shape, tall and thin, stood at the edge of the light. Its head was tilted, its hollow eyes fixed on him. Jake felt his stomach drop. The figure took a single step forward. "Trick, or treat," it whispered again, its voice dripping with something unnatural. Jake's throat was dry. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a normal house. He turned toward the door, grabbing the handle. But it wouldn't budge. The knob was ice cold, the wood warping under his touch, as if the house itself was alive. Behind him, the whisper grew sharper. "You must choose." Jake swallowed hard, his heart slamming against his ribs. He turned back slowly. The figure was closer now. Jake couldn't see its face, only the pale mask stretched across its skull, its mouth stitched shut. But something about it felt wrong. He had no choice. His voice shook. "Tea treat?" For a second, nothing happened. Then, the figure tilted its head the other way. Wrong choice. The room lurched. The walls stretched and twisted, the candlelight flickering violently. The air turned thick, heavy with the stench of decay. And then, a sharp pain exploded in Jake's chest. He collapsed to his knees, clutching at his ribcage as something inside him moved. His bones cracked. His skin burned. His fingers curled in agony as he felt something crawling beneath his flesh. And then he realized. It was changing him. Outside, Ryan and Emily heard a horrible, wet snapping sound. Jake's screams turned into something else. Something inhuman. Then, silence. Ryan's voice was a shaky whisper. "We have to go." Emily's hands trembled as she grabbed his arm. "We can't leave him." And then, the door unlocked. Slowly, it creaked open. And standing in the doorway was Jake. Or at least, what was left of him. Ryan and Emily froze. Jake stood in the doorway, but something was off. His skin was paler than before, almost like wax. His face was frozen in a wide, unnatural grin, his teeth too white, too perfect. And his eyes. His eyes were wrong. They weren't his anymore. They were empty. Black holes stretching into nothingness. Emily's heart slammed against her ribs. Jake," she whispered. Jake tilted his head. The same way the figure in the house had. Then he stepped forward. His movements were jerky, like a puppet on broken strings. Ryan took a shaky step back. "Dude, you okay?" Jake's grin widened. His voice came out warped, hollow, like an echo from somewhere far away. "Trick, or treat?" Emily's fingers dug into Ryan's arm. "Something's wrong," she whispered. Ryan didn't need convincing. He grabbed Emily's hand. "We're leaving." But as they turned, Jake moved. Faster than he should have been able to. His hand clamped onto Emily's wrist, his grip ice cold. Her breath hitched. His fingers felt too long. Too sharp. Emily screamed. Ryan shoved him back, but Jake didn't stumble. He just stood there. Unmoving. Grinning. "You have to choose," he whispered. Ryan's stomach dropped. "Choose what?" Jake's head twitched violently, as if something inside him was breaking. "Trick or treat," he whispered again. But this time, his voice wasn't his own anymore. It was layered, like many voices speaking at once. Emily's breathing came fast and panicked. "Ryan," she whimpered. "That's not Jake." Ryan already knew. Because as the porch light flickered, he saw something moving beneath Jake's skin. Shapes. Hands. Faces. Like something was inside him. Something that wasn't human. And then Jake lurched forward. His mouth stretched open. Wider than it should. Wider than was possible. And inside. There were teeth. So many teeth. Ryan and Emily ran. Behind them, Jake's voice melted into a horrible, rasping screech. The words followed them as they sprinted down the street. You have to choose. You have to choose. You have to choose. But Ryan knew. They had already chosen wrong. Ryan and Emily sprinted down the street, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The Halloween decorations blurred past them, plastic skeletons and grinning jack-o'-lanterns, nothing but smears of orange and black. They didn't stop. Didn't dare look back. Behind them, Jake's voice followed, warping and twisting in the night air. You have to choose. You have to choose. Emily sobbed, clutching Ryan's hand so tight it hurt. Where do we go? She choked out. Ryan's mind raced. His house. No, too far. Emily's. No, her parents were at a party. Then he saw it. Mrs. Thompson's house. She was the sweet old lady who always gave out full-sized candy bars. Her porch light was still on. Safety. Come on. Ryan dragged Emily up the steps, pounding on the door. Knock. 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 The sound sent a horrible chill through him. Knocking. The thing in Jake had made him knock first. Emily stiffened. Ryan, we knocked. Ryan's stomach twisted. But before he could react, the door swung open. Mrs. Thompson stood there, her gray hair neatly pinned back, her apron dusty with flour. The smell of freshly baked cookies wafted out. But her eyes were strange. Wide. Too wide. Well, aren't you two adorable, she cooed, smiling. Come in, dears. It's not safe out there. Ryan hesitated. The house smelled like cinnamon. Like warmth. But something was wrong. Emily's hand shook in his grip. She felt it too. Mrs. Thompson's smile widened. Too much. The skin at the corners of her mouth cracked and split. Ryan grabbed Emily's arm. Run. But the door slammed behind them. The house twisted. The cozy living room melted away, replaced by a long, endless hallway. The wallpaper peeled, the floorboards creaked beneath their feet. And at the end of the hall, Jake stood waiting. Or, what was left of him. His mouth still stretched impossibly wide, his skin riddled with shifting faces pressing against it. His voice came out in a broken whisper. You knocked. Ryan's breath came fast and sharp. Emily clung to him. We shouldn't have knocked, she whispered. Then. From behind them, the knocking started again. Knock. 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 And a voice. Trick or treat. But this time. It wasn't Jake's. It was someone else. Someone new. Ryan's blood ran cold. Because he understood now. Jake had knocked first. They had knocked next. And now. It was someone else's turn. The game never ended. And they were next. The knocking wouldn't stop. Knock. 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 It echoed through the twisting hallway, the sound burrowing into Ryan's skull. Emily gripped his arm, her nails digging into his skin. Ryan, her voice trembled. It's getting closer. Ryan didn't want to turn around. Didn't want to see who was knocking. Because he knew. Whoever knocked last was the next to be taken. Just like Jake. Just like them. Emily whimpered, pressing against him. What do we do? Ryan's chest heaved. His mind raced. There had to be a way out. There had to be. Jake twitched at the end of the hallway, his too wide mouth twitching, convulsing. You have to choose. Ryan squeezed his eyes shut. This was it. This was the game. He turned slowly, his heartbeat thundering. The knocking was right behind them. And standing there was a new face. A boy. No older than 10. His eyes were wide with terror. His lips quivered. He was just like they had been. Just another victim. Please, the boy whispered. I don't want to play. Emily shook violently. Oh God, Ryan. Ryan stared at the boy. Stared at his small, trembling hands. And then he understood. He grabbed Emily's wrist. We don't have to play, he whispered. Emily gasped. Ryan took one step forward. Jake's broken, twisted body jerked violently. The house shuddered. You have to choose. Ryan steeled himself. No, he said. Jake's grin faltered. The hallway groaned, the walls buckling, warping. Ryan grabbed Emily's hand and ran. Straight toward Jake. Straight through him. Jake let out a horrible, shrieking sound, his body melting into shadow. And then the hallway collapsed. Ryan and Emily hit the ground. Their lungs burned, their bodies shaken. And when they opened their eyes, they were back. Standing in the middle of the street. Halloween decorations glowed softly. Laughter filled the air. And Jake was nowhere to be seen. Emily squeezed Ryan's hand. Did we? Ryan turned pale. Across the street, a little boy stood on a porch. He raised his fist. And knocked. Knock. 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 Ryan's breath caught. The porch light flickered. And when the door opened, the game began again. The end. The knock that shouldn't be heard. The knock that shouldn't be Halloween night. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pumpkin spice and burning leaves. The streets were alive with laughter, children in costumes dashing from house to house, their candy bags growing heavier with each knock on a door. In a quiet cul-de-sac at the edge of town, a house stood dark. No decorations. No porch light. No sign of life. And yet, when midnight struck, someone knocked. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Knock. 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 Inside, 16-year-old Ben Parker was home alone. His parents were out at a Halloween party, and he had planned to spend the night binge-watching horror movies with his younger sister, Lily. But at exactly 12 a.m., the first knock came. Ben looked up from the couch, his heart skipping. Did you hear that? He asked. Lily, curled up in a blanket with a bowl of candy, nodded slowly. Yeah, but no one comes here on Halloween. Mom and Dad never put out decorations. Another knock. 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 Ben frowned. Something felt wrong. He got up, crossing to the front door. Through the peephole, no one was there. His skin prickled. Weird. He turned away. Knock. 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 Lily gasped. Ben, stop playing. I'm not, he whispered. He turned back, inhaling sharply. The peephole was black. Something was standing right outside. Ben's stomach twisted. He backed away. The knocking came again. Louder. More urgent. Bang. 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 A whisper slid through the wood of the door. Trick, or treat. Lily's grip on the blanket tightened. Ben, don't open it. He wasn't planning to. But then, the lock clicked. On its own. And the door began to open. Ben's breath caught in his throat. The front door creaked open, revealing the porch. A cold gust of wind swept inside, chilling the air. The street outside was empty, no laughing children, no rustling candy bags. The once lively Halloween night had fallen into an unnatural silence. And then, a shadow moved. A figure stepped into view. It was tall and thin, dressed in a tattered, black cloak that swayed despite the absence of wind. A hood concealed its face, but beneath the fabric, a pale, mask-like grin gleamed in the darkness. Ben froze. The figure's head tilted unnaturally, as if studying him. Then, it whispered, "Trick, or treat." Lily whimpered behind Ben. "Close the door." Ben's hand shook as he reached for the doorknob. The figure moved. One long, skeletal hand shot forward, pressing against the door before Ben could shut it. Its fingers were too long, too thin, tipped with blackened nails that scraped against the wood. A horrible sensation crawled over Ben's skin, like invisible hands were gripping his throat, squeezing. The figure leaned closer. Its mask-like face was motionless, but its voice oozed through the air like dripping tar. "You heard the knock." The hallway lights flickered. Lily screamed. Ben slammed the door shut, locking it. Silence. He stumbled back, chest heaving. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. Lily clutched his sleeve. "What was that?" Ben shook his head. "I don't know." Then, the knocking started again. Knock. 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 Ben's stomach twisted. The knocks were closer now. Not at the front door. At the back door. Lily gasped. It moved. Ben grabbed her wrist. "We're going upstairs." They ran. As they reached the second floor, the power cut out. Darkness swallowed the house. The only light came from the moon outside, spilling through the windows. And then, the knocking started again. Knock. 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 Ben's breath hitched. The sound was right outside Lily's window. They turned. And there it was. The hollow trick-or-treater stood against the glass, grinning its frozen, mask-like grin. Its hands pressed against the window, long fingers tapping the glass. A low, whispering sound filled the air, curling around them like smoke. "Let me in, let me in, let me in." The glass began to crack. Lily screamed. Ben grabbed her, pulling her away just as the window shattered. The hollow trick-or-treater crawled inside. The window exploded inward, shards of glass flying in all directions. Ben barely had time to react. He grabbed Lily and pulled her down just as jagged pieces of glass rained over them. Above them, the hollow trick-or-treater crawled through the shattered frame. It moved unnaturally, folding itself through the broken space like a spider slipping through a crack. The mask-like face remained motionless, but its body twitched, jerking in unnatural spasms. And then, it turned its head, all the way around. Lily screamed. Ben yanked her up. "Run!" They bolted down the hallway, their bare feet pounding against the wooden floor. The house shuddered, the walls groaning like they were alive. The shadows stretched unnaturally, twisting into dark, grasping fingers. Behind them, the hollow trick-or-treater moved fast, but not like a person. It crawled. On the ceiling. Its long arms and legs bent the wrong way, its fingers digging into the plaster, leaving deep, splintering cracks as it pursued them. Ben reached the stairs and stumbled down, Lily right behind him. A deep, echoing whisper slithered through the house. "There is no escape." The walls rippled, the doors vanished, replaced by solid, unbroken walls of darkness. Ben's stomach dropped. The house was changing. Lily grabbed his arm, sobbing. "Ben, what's happening?" He didn't know. But the hollow trick-or-treater was still coming. Ben looked around frantically, his eyes landed on the basement door. It was still there. Still real. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the handle and yanked it open. Total blackness yawned below. Lily hesitated. "No, Ben, we can't." The ceiling cracked. Ben shoved her inside just as the hollow trick-or-treater lunged. The thing landed where they had just stood, fingers twitching, head jerking, mask grinning. It reached out. Ben slammed the basement door shut. Darkness swallowed them. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the other side of the door, a sound. Knock. 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 Ben's breathing was ragged. He could hear Lily's shallow gasps beside him. And then, the whisper came again. Trick, or treat. But this time, it wasn't coming from behind the door. It was coming from inside the basement. Ben and Lily froze. Slowly. They turned. In the pitch-black basement, two glowing eyes blinked open. And from the darkness, dozens of bony hands began to crawl toward them. The basement was alive. The walls pulsed like rotting flesh, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. And in the darkness, they moved. Ben and Lily stood frozen as the glowing eyes multiplied, appearing one by one in the pitch-black void. And then, the hands crawled closer. Thin, bony fingers dragged across the concrete floor, nails scraping like knives on stone. Lily clutched Ben's arm, shaking violently. "Ben, what is this?" He had no answer. Because he was seeing them too. Figures emerged from the dark, their forms brittle and decayed, their flesh paper-thin and cracked like old porcelain. Some were missing eyes. Some had no mouths. Some twitched violently, their necks bent at unnatural angles, as though they had been twisted until they snapped. But they all had one thing in common. Their hands were outstretched, reaching. Lily let out a strangled sob. What are they? Ben's mind flashed back to the first knock. To the whispering voice. To the thing at the window. And suddenly, he understood. They're the ones who answered the knock. Lily's breath hitched. What? Ben swallowed hard, his pulse pounding. They knocked on the wrong door, he whispered. Or they let it in. Lily whimpered, shaking her head. No. A whisper slithered through the air, curling around them like smoke. You heard the knock, now you must choose. Ben and Lily whirled around. The hollow trick-or-treater stood behind them. Its mask-like grin gleamed in the dark, its long fingers cracking and twitching as it stretched out its hand. Trick, or treat, it whispered. Lily's breathing turned ragged. What does it mean? The figures in the basement twitched. Ben felt his stomach drop. I think, his voice was barely above a whisper. I think we have to pick one. The hollow trick-or-treater tilted its head slowly. Choose wisely. The basement figures groaned, their bodies shifting forward, closer. Ben's hands clenched into fists. The wrong choice could mean death. Or worse. He turned to Lily, whispering urgently. Lily, listen to me. We have to pick. But I don't know what happens if we choose wrong. Lily's lips trembled. I don't know, Ben, I don't. The hollow trick-or-treater took a step forward. The basement figures lunged. Lily screamed. Ben opened his mouth. And spoke one word. Trick. A sudden silence fell over the room. The hollow trick-or-treater stopped moving. The basement figures froze. Ben's pulse pounded in his ears. Did he choose right? Or did he just seal their fate? Then, the world shattered. The basement exploded into darkness, and Ben and Lily fell. Fell into nothing. Fell into the trick. Ben and Lily fell. There was no floor, no ceiling, no walls, just endless blackness, swallowing them whole. The air vanished from their lungs. Their bodies spun in the abyss, tumbling through a space that wasn't space at all. Ben reached for Lily, but his fingers passed through her like smoke. She was fading. He was fading. Then everything stopped. Ben hit solid ground. Pain exploded through his body as he landed on his side. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. His vision blurred, his limbs felt disjointed, as if his body wasn't fully his anymore. And then he heard it. A knock. 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 Ben's blood turned to ice. Slowly, he pushed himself up, his hands pressing against cold wood. His surroundings came into focus. A front porch. A quiet street. A house he didn't recognize. And beside him, Lily. She was staring straight ahead, her face pale, her hands trembling. Because standing before them, backlit by the pale glow of a porch light, was a little boy. Dressed in a Halloween costume. Holding a plastic pumpkin bucket. Looking right at them. And then Ben realized. He and Lily were not themselves anymore. They were tall. Thin. Cloaked in black. Their bodies felt unnatural, their joints too loose, too wrong. And their faces. Their faces were not their own. A frozen, mask-like grin stretched across Ben's face, smooth and expressionless. Lily let out a choked sob, her hands clutching at her cheeks, but it was too late. They were part of the trick now. And the boy at the door. He had just heard the knock. Ben tried to warn him. Tried to scream, to tell him to run, to never open the door. But all that came out was a whisper. Trick, or treat. The boy smiled, his small fingers reaching for the door handle. The cycle was starting again. And Ben and Lily would be the ones coming inside this time. The end.